We will get started at the top of the hour, which has just reached the top of the hour. A reminder that all attendees are muted and today's session is being recorded, and that you are encouraged to use the Q&A pod for any kind of questions that you have for folks on our panel, okay? And the chat box for any technology issues. So with that, I am Nadia Kalinchuk-Maynard, and I am the Trauma-Informed and Healing-Centered Lead at the South-Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. I'm so excited and humbled to be in this space with you today. Thank you for joining us for session 1 of our learning forum, Healing School Communities in the Context of Racial Violence. Where do we go from here? A few things before we get started. Housekeeping, right? So as many of us are working from home, I'm sure that many of you have become very comfortable with Zoom video meetings. In any case, just a few reminders regarding the technical logistics of the meeting today. We have made every attempt to make today's presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we will follow up using your registration information. To ensure the best audio quality for the duration of this meeting, we have muted mics for all participants except for the speakers. Okay. If you have a link to resources you'd like to share with other attendees or questions for the presenters, please enter those in the Q&A pod, and they will ensure the facilitators receive your questions later on during the Q&A session. To open the Q&A pod, hover your cursor over the Q&A and the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your video window and click on the Q&A function. We have scheduled ample time for a Q&A with our guests toward the end of the meeting, but please feel free to enter your question at any time. So you can add questions now or in between. If you have audio or technical issues during the session, the chat box is open for you to communicate with our team so they may assist you again. So a reminder that captions are available for today's session. For those who would like to enable or disable, click on the CC button on the bottom of the Zoom platform for options. And you will receive an email following the presentation on how to access a certificate of attendance. The session recording and slide deck will also be posted on our website within a few days. And if you don't already, please join us on social media and stay in touch with us. So again, welcome. If you're new to us, this two-part series is a collaborative effort of the Mental Health Technology Transfer Centers, also known as the MHTTCs. We are a network funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. The MHTTC network includes 10 regional centers, a national American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a national Hispanic and Latino center, and a network coordinating office. Our collaborative network supports resource development and dissemination, training and technical assistance, and workforce development for the mental health field. So our network also has a specific initiative, which this is a part of, that focuses on school mental health. School mental health specific activities put on by the MHTTCs through the School Mental Health Initiative encompass multiple service and modes, various topic areas and populations that you can see right here. So this learning forum is just one example of the training we offer through the school mental health workforce, all free of cost. We invite you to visit our website to learn more. We'll add the link in the chat box for everyone. After today's session, we encourage you to visit our website and find your regional center to keep in touch for more resources and training opportunities. You can see the blocks of color, those are the regional centers. And a really quick disclaimer, this presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The opinions expressed in this learning session are the views of our moderator and panelists and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. As a part of receiving SAMHSA funding, we are required to submit evaluation data related to the quality of this event at the end of today's training. We ask that you please take a moment to complete a brief survey about today's session. All attendees will be automatically redirected to the survey when closing the webinar window when this event ends. So these are our principles, MHTTC principles. The MHTTC network uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. That language is strengths-based and hopeful and inclusive and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and experiences. Healing-centered and trauma-responsive. Inviting to individuals participating in their own journeys, person-first and free of labels, non-judgmental and avoiding assumptions, respectful, clear, and understandable, consistent with our actions, policies, and practices. If we can take a moment to just reflect on this, on our principles, and apply this to our dialogue as we move throughout our time together today. Now, that was a lot. That was a lot of information. So let's take a moment to settle in. I invite you to settle in with your breath and take a moment. So taking a moment to settle in, inviting you to engage in a grounding to your breath, to your body. Because sometimes our breath is not readily available to us. I want to offer up a few other ways as well.
I
Perhaps you're
see
already engaging your breath, and if
myself in
your breath keeps
joy
moving,
and
the
love.
rhythm of these voices.
I know
The breath is
myself
not
I
available. Perhaps you
am
can tense
enough.
and release your
I
muscles,
see
starting with your
myself
feet
in
and moving all
joy
the way up.
and love.
Or
I
fix your gaze
know
gently on a calming
myself
image,
I am
perhaps a
enough.
photo of a loved one or something
I
close to you.
see myself in
With each
joy
breath,
and love.
muscle release and moment,
I know
the messages
myself I
and things
am
that get in the
enough.
way of sitting with this moment get
I
smaller,
see
and your
myself
connection to your
in
wisdom,
joy
your strength
and love.
grow, your
I
connection to the collective
know
wisdom, to the collective
myself
learning
I
grow
am
together,
enough.
take more
I
space and
see
more life,
myself in
taking a moment to acknowledge this
joy
power,
and love.
knowing that
I
this breath,
know
this feeling is
myself
available
I
for you
am
throughout your journey.
enough. I
The invitation
see
to stay grounded in that which brings
myself
us
in
and
joy
keeps us together
and love.
stands.
I know
Take a
myself
moment to
I am
sit with this,
enough. I see myself in
be
joy
yourself,
and love.
enjoy,
I know
and love.
myself I am enough. I see myself in joy and love. I know.
So let's have a conversation about changing the world. We are honored, pleased to invite Ebony Adedayo to moderate both of her sessions of this learning series. Ebony is a skilled facilitator, an educator, community organizer, scholar, and much, much more. Ebony, thank you for being with us today. I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Nadia, and thank you to the network for having me back again for this wonderful, this much needed conversation um, around healing school communities in the context of racial violence. As Nadia has already said, this was an opportunity for us to come back together from our first conversation back in August to continue this much needed discussion as COVID continues, the racial violence that impacts our students continues. Um, the conversation we had in August, it initiated a response to heightened systemic violence and glaring racial inequities that were exacerbated by the pandemic. Today, we are going to embark on a two-part learning series intended to center the conversation in healing. Our hope today is that together we forge a way towards a more humanizing schooling system for students, families, educators, and school mental health professionals. Today's two-part series aims to call light to the racial violence our students experience and its impact on their mental health. Additionally, we hope to elevate the powerful work taking place in our school communities across the country to shift the paradigm within schools to a space where collective healing and social transformation is conducive. Our intentions today are threefold. Is to offer a conversation that focuses on strategies for supporting students' mental health while navigating racial violence in and out of school. We are also offering up opportunities for the field to improve its commitment to fostering a workforce that is ready, able, and willing to hold racial violence as a mental health issue. And our intention is to also offer steps we might be able to take to advance school mental health supports for students experiencing racial violence. Today's session focuses on learning from and with cultural keepers, practitioners, scholars, advocates, and systems leaders. It's not an all-encompassing how-to. To that end, 3 notes for us as we move ahead. School mental health is complicated work. Navigating the impact of racial violence is complicated work. For some of us, this is an entirely new conversation, and for others, very familiar and part of our everyday. We do not expect that 2 90-minute conversations will address everything, nor should they. We are centering this conversation on understanding the deeply ingrained, ever-pervasive, anti-Black, Indigenous, and persons of color racial violence that exists within schooling. This does not mean that we are not interested or invested in students or school mental health advocates who do not identify as BIPOC, but because by serving BIPOC youth and families, everyone benefits. We also recognize that the COVID pandemic surfaced the architecture of structural violence, the racial disparities in distance learning outcomes, the racial disparities in COVID grief and death, the racial disparities in shelter in place and work-life equity issues, meaning we will not get to everything today. And we are not only defining racial violence by the police-involved shooting of Black and Brown Americans, but we're also defining racial violence as how it shows up in our curriculum, our school policies, our SEL programming, our mental health frames, all of it. It shows up in all of it. To that end, we do offer up a couple of working agreements as we listen in. To all of us, we will be in listen and reflect mode. You are invited to submit questions for the Q&A portion or send resources you would like our network to promote. Agree, argue, aspire. With what do you agree? With what do you argue? To what do you aspire? We also want to expect and accept the lack of closure. We won't get to everything today, and that's okay. This work is ongoing. To present our guests, we agree and commit to making space, stepping in and stepping back when there is a question posed to all of us. And we commit to keeping our thoughts brief, 2 to 3 minutes per remark if we can, spoken from our role and our experience and respecting the frame and nonpartisan audience of this network. And raise your finger when you want to speak, or raise your hand with the Zoom function. So let's begin and let's dive in and meet our guests. We have Virgil Moorhead, Tiffany Marie, Jerica Coffey, Nora Jones Bay, Tamba Kui Bailey, and Jorge Santos. For their complete bios, please see the network's link online for who these people are, these wonderful guests are, and the work that they do. So you can follow them on all of the socials and read their materials as well. We also encourage all guests to put up resources, thoughts, and responses to questions that come up in the chat box so we can make this 90 minutes as dynamic as possible. So let's dive in. I would like the guests to each, let's go around and let's introduce ourselves. So briefly state your name, your role, your location, your pronouns, and if you can also share one thing that you've been doing to tend to your own wellness and mental well-being. And whoever would like to start can kick us off.
I'll start. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jerica Coffee. I go by she, her. I'm coming to you from unceded Ohlone territory. Some people also know that as Oakland. Oakland is where, first and foremost, I'm a mother and where my daughter attends Oakland Public Schools. It's also where I teach and learn and struggle with youth in East Oakland. I also work in the teacher prep program at City College of San Francisco. I'm happy to be here with you all.
Thank you, Jerica. Who would like to go next?
Hello, everyone. My name is Nora Jones Bay. So glad to have you with us today to learn and grow. I'm originally from the Bay Area, so shout out to anybody there, but I'm currently in Brooklyn, where I also have roots. I have history background of being a teacher, but also directing youth programming after school. Shout out to the South Bronx, to Excel Academy, to Fannie Lou Hamer Freedom High School. I also am a graduate student, graduate candidate at NYU, where I'm pursuing a doctorate and working with young people around critical literacy issues. My pronouns are she and her. And one thing I love to do, I have to shout them out, is Girl Trek. If you don't know about them, find them. But walking, getting out in the morning and getting some fresh air and playing some good music or a really good podcast and learning as I'm walking. So glad to be here.
I can go next. Just thank you for having me, first and foremost. My name is Jorge Santos, pronouns he, his, him. I'm a restorative justice coordinator out in Brooklyn, New York, at a middle school. The way I am spending my time is on Netflix. I'm trying to stay home as much as possible. I've been on Netflix watching a lot of shows. I've been reading as well. Can't just watch the shows, I have to read a little bit. But I can't wait for the spring just so I can get out there and play a little basketball. I definitely miss it. It's cold up here, so I can't do it even if I wanted to. So I can't wait for that, being able to just play a little ball and just relax.
I could go. Hello, my name is Virgil Moorhead. I'm up here in Northern California in Humboldt County, currently on the land of the Wiyot people, and I'm part of the Big Lagoon Rancheria, which is Yurok and Tolowa Native American. I'm the executive director at Two Feathers Native American Family Services, which is in Humboldt, McKinleyville, and then I'm also trained as a clinical psychologist. For self-care, I do a lot of exercise, reading, spending, really focusing on being in the present and really trying to practice kindness and being compassionate to myself and others. And so I'm glad to be here.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Tiffany, or Tiffany Marie, and I am bringing greetings also from Ohlone land in the Bay Area. I always try to tell that I'm the daughter of Cheryl Marie, the great granddaughter of Dorothy Wilson and Annette Williams, and I'm the great granddaughter of Olivia Williams and Artelia Green. Both sides of my family come from Arkansas. I come from a long, long line of Arkansas educators, healers, and service workers. And my lineage extends also to West Africa, amongst the Khan and Yoruba people. And my wellness practices really reside in what I consider to be my sacred purpose, which is to restore myself and my people's relationship to ancestral wisdom in the natural world. And so, as a storyteller and educator, I'm humbled to share my experiences with you all today. And thank you for having me.
Hello, my name is Tom Bequee Bailey. Greetings to everyone. I see that people all across the U.S., as well as I think I saw someone in India, U.S. Virgin Islands, and definitely shout out to Maryland and North Carolina. Those are my home states. So I appreciate seeing people representing from there as well. I am trained as a counseling psychologist. I work in higher ed. I am an assistant professor in counseling psychology. I'm also an assistant vice provost for equity and inclusion. And in terms of just dealing with every day and us getting through COVID and life and all the like, I think as many people saying, exercise, trying to connect with my spiritual presence. And then on fun, one of my homegirls and I we do a podcast, and we have a 25-year relationship, and it's a lot of fun for us. So that's kind of how we get through. Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for being here. We are going to go ahead and get started with the questions. And I have a couple of questions for us all to answer, and then I'll dive into questions specific for individual people. I'll have a couple of people answer this first question. The subtitle of the event is Where Are We Now? So much has occurred in the last year, as you all know. If you could describe the context of teaching, learning, and leading schools in this moment, what are you seeing as the most pressing issues facing young people, caretakers in schools regarding racial violence? What is most unique about this time we are experiencing in regards to relational dynamics, emotional well-being, student needs, policy, and staffing? So if you have a couple of folks answer that 2 or 3 minutes each. Go ahead, Jerica. I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Thank you for these questions, and thank you for Ebony in the introduction, this framing of racial violence as beyond these sort of like explicit examples of violence that we see when we see state-sanctioned violence brutalizing and murdering Black and brown bodies in the streets. And of course, that's one aspect of racial violence that needs to be tended to when we think about how we support ourselves and support our students' mental health and the impacts of race-based trauma. But in addition to that, the work continues to be addressing all the myriad of ways that white supremacy enacts racial violence against our communities in the everyday realities of schools. And so the attack on our people continues to be multifaceted. And so I think that our response continues to need to be multifaceted. So, we need to continue to work to get police out of our schools. We need to continue to interrupt exclusionary discipline practices. We need to continue to interrupt the ways that systemic racism gets enacted in policies, like, for example, in Oakland, through school closures. And we need to continue to do the challenging work of dealing with our colleagues and helping folks understand that race-based trauma is a real thing, and what are its manifestations in the classroom. And last, I feel like we really need to continue to figure out all the ways to disrupt deficit thinking and help folks understand that that is in and of itself a way that we participate in race-based trauma and race-based violence. But to the part of the question of what's unique about this moment, I feel like what's unique about this moment in my 22 years in education is that there's openings now that we have not seen before. And so here locally in Oakland, what that's looked like is after 10 years of organizing, the Black Organizing Project, and then, at the end of that, really with a lot of support from teachers in mass, in response to the mass mobilizations, got the school police defunded here in Oakland, which was, we're a district where we don't have libraries in our schools, right? But we got a $6 million police budget. And so that defunding, the policy, the mobilization around it, it's an opening that we just haven't seen before. And of course, it was 10 years in the making, but because we were ready to fight, then that, we were able to take advantage of that opening. And when we think about how do we make our schools safe for Black and brown children and safe from the impacts of race-based trauma, it's work like that, right? So I'm excited about, living in this moment and being able to continue doing work to expand that opening even further. But probably folks know that even last night, this historic reparations vote happened here in Oakland to deal with decades of disinvestment in the Black community, and even that just would have been unheard of, last year. So it's a pretty amazing time to be living through, as much as we're continuing to experience the horrific impact of race-based violence.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Jerica, to that question. Does anyone else want to chime in to the question? Yes, Noor.
Thank you so much. I think about Jerica, you gave us so much, so much to like chew on and to think through. And as I think about the where are we now, I situate ourselves in this moment where there's layered, already intersectional forms of violence that folks are experiencing. But then again, COVID, right? Like, so if I sit and think about the way in which the South Bronx, and I think this is something that is a nationwide conversation that's happening, but how COVID has also exposed so many different forms of racialized violence that has hit our students, our families, and our communities in really particular ways that one, I think is really important for us to think about in this moment is what it means to slow down and stop what we're doing. To really slow down and stop what we're doing, because we understand certain forms of racialized violence, but the ways in which COVID has put even more pressure on students, on families, on communities that don't have the access to resources that we already knew about prior, that one of the main things that I call for is for people to stop following the rules of what is supposed to happen, or the boundaries of the grant, or the boundaries of what school is supposed to look like, but ask ourselves, can we slow down and listen and see what the young people, what their families, what they're experiencing, enough for us to say that business as usual is not possible. We already knew that as folks of color, as Indigenous, we were moving through a world that was not working for us. And when I think about racialized violence, I think about it as something that is moving through the water. It is moving through every single thing that we do, whether that is psychology, whether that is in the institution, whether that is in the everyday movement from school to home, right? And so when I think about how racialized violence is affecting us, our caretakers, our schools, the big piece is for us to slow down and to recognize that we are our greatest advocates. And the best way for us to do this as teachers, as people with professional degrees, as people who are psychologists, is to realize we don't know. And the question is, if I don't know, how will I find out? And who will I believe is somebody who is useful to teach me? Will I look back at the book or my degree? Or will I stare in the face of the young person who's struggling or not showing up, who I think might be difficult, but is actually going to be the option or the way for me to push some systemic changes, right? And this is something that connects to like Black activism, radical ways of being, which are like, we stop and we listen. When something's coming, we stop and we listen, and everyone helps us. Everyone is a knowledge keeper. So one of the ways that I see us addressing that is actually stopping. And a part of that means we push back against principals, we push back against other teachers, we push back against the business as usual norms that are constantly pressing us, right? This is one of the things that I think is really necessary in this current moment, recognizing that our young people are still also navigating the violence in the streets, the media, right? The ways in which they're working to try to understand their self-esteem, who they are, be in their bodies in a moment of crisis. And that layer continues to get at them, right? And all of us in a particular way that I think as leaders in our communities, as leaders in our spaces, is for us to really stop and listen.
Thank you so much, Noor. Anyone else on this question before we continue to move ahead? If not, I'm going to go ahead and ask the next question. Given some of what Jerica and Noor have already talked about, what are some of the specific ways in which you see racial violence surfacing in schools or impacting the state of schooling today? Actually, I'm going to skip that question because that was very similar to what we did just discuss. So I'll move on to the following one. How do you see social stressors related to racial violence impacting students' ability to engage in school, their vision for their future, or the way it is shaping their concept of self, and what they believe is possible in the world. Who would like to take a stab at that?
I can maybe start us off if that's okay.
Absolutely.
With folks. So one of the things I think we have to think about, and Nora, I really appreciate you saying coming back into COVID. So COVID is that underlying thing, but there have been problematic things happening within the communities for Black and Brown people, for people of color, pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID. So I think we can't forget that fact, right? It didn't just happen today. But one of the first things I'll say, and looking at some of the literature, and I think Jericho was maybe making this point earlier, oftentimes in the school, there's this invalidation process that's happening. So somebody experiences racism, they experience invalidation and microaggression in and outside of the school, and they go and they talk to a teacher, they talk to a counselor, and that experience is invalidated, right? And I'm sure Jorge probably is going to bring the truth later on too, so I don't want to talk too much. But what that does is it impacts self-esteem and it impacts self-efficacy. So what we see is about second and third grade, we see that somebody's been raising their hand constantly in class and they're not being called on. And actually, when we start talking about white supremacy, we're not saying that it's just white individuals engaging in white supremacy. Everybody can internalize that negative perception about how we understand and perceive people of color. So I do want to make that point. But what happens then is if I'm constantly told that I don't have value, if I'm dehumanized, violence or no violence, right? So Jerica said that there's disproportionate rate of expulsion and suspension for people of color. There's a higher percentage, and she didn't say this, but I'm going to add to it, a higher percentage of people of color who are in special education. And I'm not talking about honors or AP, which is also special education. So when we start looking at that, we start looking at people who are not necessarily disciplined, but removed from the classroom. And I think y'all know what I'm talking about. They say you need to go outside in the hall, or you need to go to such and such, but that doesn't count. So now what's happening is we've impacted self-esteem, we've impacted self-efficacy, and we've contributed to all those factors that starts to tell those young people that they don't matter. And if I don't matter, then I start to say, well, school isn't worth it. And if I start saying school isn't worth it, then my academic attendance and performance suffers. And then we start finding our young people in a cycle. So I think those are some things. I don't want to talk too long. I know my peers are going to have some great things to say, but I think those are some of the things initially I would say when we start looking at this and the impact. I think we have to look at the mental health and its consequences, not just in that one academic year, that month, but long-term, right? And it impacts the pipeline. So I think these are some of the first things I would say, but I definitely want to welcome my peers and hear their perspectives.
I could jump in. That's helpful. And I think, for me, it was really important as an educator of 15 years, is to set some context for how I even think about what we're doing and this discourse that we're describing. And so for me, it's always important to differentiate schooling from education. And so a lot of what we're talking about and experiencing really is schooling. And we conflate them often. And I think for the sake of this conversation, it's really important to disentangle those two. So when we talk about schools and we talk about schooling, we're talking about institutions responsible for sustaining white supremacy and settler colonial values. Let's be very clear. And historically, we know that so many Black folks and many of us and how we got to this country was through being kidnapped and forcibly here. And our history with these institutions, we weren't even allowed to be a part of these institutions. You don't get universities, you don't get schools without Native genocide. You don't get, some of the first departments and programs at universities were plantation studies. All of, the origin of schooling works against the dark body, works against the brown body. I think it's important to contextualize that. And in that history, we only get offered access to this institution because of the fear of rebellion. That's the only reason we're offered. And schooling becomes a means of what many researchers call this seasoning process, the stripping of our language, our cultural understandings, all of our means of sustaining ourselves, really to create what they call a comprador class. Some folks on the block would call these people snitches. Others would say that key people who were taught through schools to suppress rebellion. And so when we talk about where we are, we talk about violence and racialized violence, I think it's important to say that schools are, a lot of times we talk about addressing violence in schools, but my work says, well, let's also address the violence and toxicity that is school, that is schooling. We can't leave that unchecked. And so when we begin to contextualize that, I think, and separate that, then we can get a little bit closer to education, which are the knowledges, the stories, the frameworks that sustain us, our people, and our wellness. And so when we look at like where we are, when we look at these violences that we're talking about, particularly for Black people, highest infant mortality rate, right? Lowest life expectancy. You know, we don't have as much access to wealth. It's declining as we continue to live. These are intentional outcomes of schooling. And so as we move forward in this conversation, I think a lot of what becomes really important, and my work looks at not the easier forms of racialized violence in school, which we might say are dropouts and suspensions and such. My work looks at the harder conversations around those who we suggest are doing well. And it looks at the physiological makeup of our body and our participation in this institution. And I don't need to necessarily cite data, but what we know is so many of the people that we know who continue on in this system, they're dying. We're not doing well. And so I would argue, and I want to reiterate, that one of the, if not the greatest forms, right? The Ku Klux Klan cannot operate in the same way. Jails cannot lock everybody up. The police can't even harass everybody if they want to. Schools, however, are the primary institution across the longest span of time that has been able to norm the harassing of our bodies. And so in that, I want to contextualize that and ground that in so much of what we're talking about today.
I love what Tiffany said, right? That idea of where school comes from, this indoctrination, right? The removal of cultures to forcefully assimilate Black and Indigenous people. And that's something that we have to think about. What you get today is a descendant of that, right? We're trying to change that with this conversation. Um, One thing that I wanted to touch on too is that schools ultimately there's a simulation, right, of real life. And for our students, what happens normally when they enter this space, their first interaction with racism happens in school, right? Whether that be a student that told them a racial slur, or that's a teacher that says a microaggression, where those are policies like hairstyle policies or dress code policies, or you know. Conflicts where a teacher feels like they have authority over their students, and sends them off to the dean. So I think what happens is that Black and brown students, they notice that predominantly they're being targeted. So naturally that's going to cause stress, that's going to cause certain traumas, and they're dealing with that conflict. So in a space that isn't providing them a voice, then that's frustrating. That's frustrating for anyone. And I think that we grow frustrated as people of color in schools. And I think that's where we check out. So, you know, and at a young age, we imagine telling them, hey, use your voice, right? We always tell young children, hey, use your voice, use your words. And then the minute that our students of color voice their opinions, the minute that they say, hey, this is wrong, this is an injustice on me, schools have consequences on them. Now, I think that one of the biggest impacts of being silent is that we need our students to speak up. It is dangerous if they are silent. I'm a huge advocate for our students to speak up. And my hope is that Black and brown children, and hopefully all the educators here, teach them to speak up. Use your voice. Their voices are super powerful. They should be voicing their feelings, their concerns, because the world needs to start listening and it needs to start changing.
That's right. Thank you so much, Jorge, for your remarks. We're going to move ahead to the pointed questions. Virgil, I saw you went off mute. Were you going to contribute before we did?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, I think we stated it, but I think it's important to explicitly state it, bringing class, sort of socioeconomic status into the conversation, because I think when we talk about experiencing invalidation, experiencing judgment, looking down, you know, being just feel a sense of inferior, it's often those that are on the lower socioeconomic status, and that includes in our, you know, indigenous Black communities. And I think that we have to always bring that into consideration, because, you know, I think when, let's say folks from my community, if we're taught and raised in these schools, it's the goal is to jump over the fence and forget about who we come from and where we come from. And oftentimes the ones that are left behind are those that are on the bottom of the socioeconomic status. And so it's imperative for us as folks that are about social justice equity to continue to be proximate with the ones that are on the margins within our own sort of, if you say, categories of people as like indigenous people. And I think that's the disservice that a lot of schooling continues to do, is that we, some of our best talented folks end up in the university or end up in the governmental agencies in away from those that are most in need. And I think just to summarize, I think Brian Stevenson talks about this, and I always say it, is we have to stay proximate to where suffering is the most, including our most talented folks. And that's where I think there can be improvements.
Thank you so much for the contribution. We are going to move ahead to a question for Jorge and Jerica. As educators, what does supporting students in navigating racial violence look like in the classroom through curriculum, relationship building, classroom management, and cohesion? What training, support, and preparation did you explicitly receive in your education to prepare you for leading this work? And what do you wish you had received?
Well, I think our schools have to be safe havens for our students, a place where they're celebrated, a place where they're dignified for who they are. We should be embracing everyone's worth and uniqueness, especially in their identity. So how do we do that? How does that look like? We're going to need curriculum. We're going to need curriculum that reflects students' experiences, acknowledges the stories of people who look like them, who are involved in this and engaging in this liberation work, which there's so many. And it's sometimes that gets removed from the classroom, and our stories, the Black and brown stories, become invisible in the curriculum of our schools. One thing that we need to do, we need to implement strategies for teachers to build rapport with students, built on trust and vulnerability. Teachers need to expose who they are, right? Paul Ferrero says that in Pedagogy of Freedom, we need to expose who we are. Let our students know who we are. Our students are always saying, I want my teachers to be real. They know, our students know fake. Trust me, they know right away. The minute that we're real, they'll trust us. And that plays a huge role. I do believe that we have to engage in restorative justice practices and implementing de-escalation methods to better support students and the way that teachers interact with their students. We have to learn, we have to lean into community, and every student has to feel like they belong. If our students don't feel like they belong to that community, to that school, they're gonna have a hard time. So educators have to ask themselves, what are we doing to allow them to feel like this is their place, this is their second home, this is their safe haven? Some of the work that I've been doing personally to continue growing is diving into the philosophies and foundations of restorative justice. How do I grow to be a moral and just person? How do I teach my students to become a moral and just person? What is it to be moral? What is it to be just? Those are all conversations that I'm having with myself, centering around bringing in other people, because I do believe that it's a community, right? First, there's the self, finding out what is my role, but then bringing in everybody else together. And then one thing that I really think educators need to be doing is studying the way oppression shows up. How does oppression show up in your life? How does privilege show up in your life? How does it show up in your classroom? And then thinking about ways to dismantle the inequities, right? If we can find ways to dismantle those inequities and those structures, that's how we can start building a new and transform education, as I would say. So really focusing on inequities and taking it from there is very key for us to kind of, like, if we want to hone in on one thing, it's like, if we know we're giving homework and students of color are not able to do homework, well, why? And then maybe removing the homework that in regards to counting towards their grade. It's not important, right? It's not important for a student to have their grade, deterred because they can't do it at home because they don't have high-speed internet. So that's something that educators need to really rethink.
Thank you for all of that, Jorge. I want to begin my comments by coming back to something that Tiffany shared. I so appreciate. I'm like my wheels are spinning with your sharing earlier, and I think that one of the ways that we build up students' psychic armor um, in the face of racial violence is by teaching them the difference between education and school. And I think that that's really important so that they don't internalize their experiences and turn on themselves the way that many of us have, at different points in our education trajectory. So I feel like, as a teacher, I really have learned to develop a critical race pedagogy over time so that students can understand the nature of society. I think the more that they understand how things are set up, the more that they deepen their existing critical consciousness, because they come to us with a critical consciousness. I think you spoke to that, right, Jorge? They know what's up, right? And um, so I think we need to think about how our curriculum can build off of the critical perspectives that they're coming to school with, knowing that things are set up a certain way, knowing that things are not working for them. And I think that that's the psychic armor that they can embody, and then that allows them to really embody the legacy of resistance. That's their birthright. That's our birthright. Um, and so I think that also building off what Jorge said, we have to make sure that what we teach and how we teach communicates to our children that it's safe for them to be themselves, that who they are is valuable, that who they are is welcomed in our learning spaces, that who they are and who their communities are have where they come from merits being reflected in our curriculum. And to that question of like, where does the preparation come from? I have to say that everything I've learned of value has been in autonomous community solidarity spaces where BIPOC teachers, students, community folks have come together to employ and enact radical imagining and really build anti-racist education in the way that we know will work for our people, for ourselves. And so there's lots of examples of this going on in the world right now, right? There's the People's Education Movement, the Association of Raza Educators. There's a healing collective called Hella out here in the Bay that is teaching teachers and doing some knowledge sharing around healing practices. And I just want to bring this into the forum because I feel like I'm skeptical of the idea that we can imagine and build anti-racist education in state sanctioned institutions for all the reasons folks have mentioned. I think that, I've got my feet in these institutions as well. That's where my people are. But I haven't really been able to be a part of anything that has fully been able to build that vision. So I think we build it in autonomous spaces and then we push in. A great example of that, just to give a nod to transformative justice work, that's not only doing the work to address conflict and harm as it comes up in schools, but also to teach young folks how to organize and change the very systems that cause harm, is Palante out of Holyoke, Massachusetts. And again, built outside of the school system, then pushed in and is forcing the institution to change dramatically. And so yeah, I want to bring that in here, and I'd love to hear folks' ideas about, what's the role of working within and without to really make schools safer and support our students.
Thank you, Jerica. Lots of thought-provoking things that you just raised in the piece around the working the inside and the outside. I want to pivot this next question to Dr. Moorhead. How do you see racial violence impacting the biopsychosocial health of young people and their caregivers, intergenerational trauma, complex and compound trauma?
I think, within, I'll speak about my community within, I think it's really, you know, important to look again around the sort of class and these intergenerational cycles within certain families, within certain, neighborhoods, parts of communities. And by not, focusing on disrupting those intergenerational patterns from a very early age and putting a lot of our, like I said before, our best talent, our all of our efforts in these communities and uplifting those with more privilege within our own community that are able to succeed more in the sort of middle class sensibilities, that's just perpetuating a cycle of you know biopsychosocial harm. That I was on a call 2 days ago with the governor's office and this panel on insurance, and I talked about how when the pandemic first hit, because at Two Feathers we serve those kids that are often in families that are often experiencing that intergenerational trauma, and I said that there was an improvement in mental health for many of our kids that we see, and the facilitator's like, what are you talking about? I said, because schools are harmful to our kids' mental health, especially those kids that are struggling the most, especially those kids that have been through intergenerational, structural, systemic, complex trauma. And you force them to sit in a classroom for 8 hours a day. When they got out and didn't have to go to school, their mental health was improving because they had autonomy. They had freedom of what they wanted to do with their day. They weren't feeling judged. And then, but what I think the opportunity is now they're coming back in and saying, hey, I need mental health services, because they're missing those relationships, that social connection. So their mental health improved right when the pandemic hit, as I observed, because schooling was detrimental to their mental health. But now they're missing that social connection. The video games or the whatever is not sort of meeting the needs. And so I think that if we can, this is all to say, being relationally based, really being informed by the best of traditions such as indigenous people, informing schools, then we can change those biopsychosocial patterns. And we have to focus on the most vulnerable. There's, and how does the school, and how, if our most vulnerable community members aren't well, then we're not well as a community. And we can never forget that.
Thank you. I appreciate you talking about the dichotomy between the two ways that people are experiencing mental health. Like on one hand, it's improving; on the other hand, because of the lack of the relationships, it's deteriorating. I think this is a great setup for our next question for Tiffany Marie. Can you talk to us about how culturally responsive school-based interventions can be used to support healing, including co-regulation, student empowerment, and other opportunities?
Definitely. I don't know if I can talk about school-based interventions as much as I can talk about interventions that happen around the school. So just to provide some context, my research looks at and examines something called telomeres, which could be known as like the caps on our cells. They protect our cells, our DNA. And what tends to diminish that protection is stress. And so if we think about our young people that we work with and that we serve, those are typically young people who are experiencing a tremendous amount of stress and what Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris calls toxic stress. So when we got our young people about 3 years ago in our last cohort and began to assess and see what was happening with them physiologically, we found that we had 14-year-olds who had the cellular makeup of someone who was triple their age, who were breast cancer survivors, okay? And a lot of us, we don't have that content. We don't get to work with labs and do that work with all of our young people. But this just provided some context as to who was coming in front of us. And my colleague, Kendris Watson at UCLA at the time, was doing a very similar study with about 50 Black men, looking at some of the most successful Black men, top of their class at UCLA. who also had diminished cells, greatly diminished cells. And so as part of what I was talking about in that last question and thinking about who we even call, those who we say are doing well, and what that really means. And so our intervention actually, we met children in school. I'm a classroom teacher in some regards, but so much of our work was antithetical to schooling. And so our intervention was really about centering ancestral practices and ways of being. So our children, all of our children, were engaging in learning their indigenous languages. Even our Black children who were learning Yoruba, who were learning Tree, because often we say, well, what do we do with Black kids? We are indigenous people as well. Our young people, we helped, to push them or at least give them more space throughout the day to redevelop our relationship with the natural world. We had elders, we had intergenerational models. And so some of this happened in the school, but a lot of what was happening, we got in a lot of trouble for because it's antithetical to schooling. And what we found out in just 1 year, so our goal was really to diminish, it was to slow down the diminishing of our young people's cells. That was it, because telomeres shorten every year as you get older with age. What we found after just 1 year with all of our Black children in our program and the scientists and the labs that we were working with were shocked, because we found that we can regrow our young people's cells. And we found an interrelated connection between the centering of our ancestral practices, our indigenous practices, which we know as education, and the regrowing and protection on our bodies. And so that became a really important intervention. And then Kinjis, who was at UCLA, we shared the results with him. So a lot of the Black men in his study, as I mentioned, were not doing as well. And we shared in one Black man who he stayed in contact with, we shared these practices, and he passed those on to him. And we found out that even through COVID, we got results in November. We saw that his cells also began to grow, to regrow. And so a lot of this, we have a short documentary on it that I can share in the chat, but a lot of this work, which is really interesting, because when we were teaching or having folks teach Nawa to our students, our Spanish teacher was trying to come into the class and take our kids to go to Spanish class, right? We're just like, well, that's also a colonial language too, right? So it was this really weird conflict with, and what we'll find, and I talked about us being kidnapped people, is I think in many ways we still are to the normative practices and procedures of schooling. And you can find that out anytime you try to do something that actually centers young people's wellness. See what happens, see who comes for us. So that's just a little bit of what we did. And that's why I said, it was in proximity to schools because that's where kids were, but schools actually needed to be removed as far away from our young people so that they actually could reclaim their health.
Thank you, Tiffany. I've only recently learned about telomeres, and so I appreciate you bringing it into the conversation because I find it so interesting, especially this fact that we can regrow them. It makes me think about neuroplasticity too, like our bodies can heal themselves. I think this is we can talk about like joy now, and I want to tailor this question to Nora specifically. Can you speak to some of the ways you've intentionally cultivated joy in space for young people in the process of addressing police violence, and why you think the cultivation of joy is vital in the face of oppression and all that we're holding right now?
Thank you so much for that question. And I think it dovetails beautifully in what Tiffany was sharing, as well as Virgil and everyone on this space. But a big piece of it, I came at working in a school, working in after school, right? And I also started working in even starts, right? So these are places that, there's not a lot of the structure that's happening in the school day. And from that place, we had space for families, for intergenerational connection, for parents to come in and share the things that they do, for cooking, a little bit of space for dancing, space for youth to come in and show the things that they love to do outside of the school space. And so moving out, and again, to connect with this piece around education and schooling, my research connects to Carnival and Black education, right? So thinking about the lineages, the diasporic lineages that connect Black people globally, pushing against slavery, colonization, and also how do we connect back to these pieces? And I really love, Tiffany, your point. How do we not only connect back to this knowledge that also heals us, right? And oftentimes in the school space, that is not accessible, but even more, if I laugh too loud in a school space, even as an educator, I could be reprimanded by my colleagues, right? So for me, the importance of joy was something that I noticed because I saw it sucked out of the classroom, and the ways in which youth came to participate in joy, whether that was in the hallways, in the school lunchroom, or all these different places where the teachers weren't around to tell them what to do. So joy is something that our young people and our families are creating regularly. It is a resistance practice that connects us globally, right? It's a part of this manifestation of pleasure, manifestation of trusting and loving our bodies. And so for me, that came out of expression, right? And a Black feminist lineage that tells us about the uses of the erotic. It tells us that our bodies are not only just a thing that we're supposed to work and use, but our bodies are a place that we're supposed to enjoy and play and feel good in. And so for me, a part of what that was listening. And again, to start with my first point, was slowing down to realize that there was so much that I don't know because of the schooling, right, that I had moved through that told me what success was to cut off my smile, was to make myself look more a white heteronormative, to speak in a particular cadence. And if I move too fast, oh my gosh, it's a problem. You know, if I, cut off a certain syllable on as I'm speaking, all of a sudden I'm not smart. But a big part of cultivating joy for me was connecting back to these knowledges that Tiffany's talking about, was creating space that this knowledge is not just linguistic, but it's embodied. This knowledge is something that's a beat. This knowledge that is something that's that giggle that comes in the middle of class that maybe as a teacher I'm mad at, but you need to slow down and figure out why they're laughing and why they need that joy. Right? Because there might be this moment where those telomeres are shortening and they're saying, guess what? I need resistance, right? And so for me, a part of building joy, and this is why I really want to remind everybody here that it's not about us giving you the answers. It's about you slowing down in your work to pay attention to who is in front of you and the gifts that they can offer you through their bodies, through their resistance legacies, their histories, and that it's not a matter of looking up to, Virgil said this beautifully about proximity, right? Like sometimes we look to the doctors, right? But what I really want us to think about when we're talking about school mental health and racial violence is that oftentimes we're taught to look at the deficit model. We're taught to look at the way oppression functions, and we speak about it from a white, like centering whiteness, oppression. And my research really says, no, boo-boo, giving you no more time. We're going to actually slow down and listen to our young people. We're going to pay attention when they haven't smiled, when they haven't laughed. We're going to recognize that that means we're not doing the right thing. That means that we have to ask some questions. How am I teaching? How am I holding space that is violent to you? And not just talking over it, but holding space for it, right? And a part of that is recognizing that us as the adults in the room, that we are a part of an intergenerational collective, and the young people are too. And so they are here because they have family, they have community, they have people who have held them in both their joy and also in their stresses, right? And these different things. So it's not a matter of mental health as being something that can only be dictated from, a psychology book, but us moving to recognize that how we can actually heal ourselves are very much within the rooms that we work, right? Within the communities that we work with. So I'll give a couple examples. Thank you for listening through this. But one of the ways in the South Bronx, shout out to Fannie Lou Hamer in regards to police violence, but also in regards to other issues in the community. We have a peace block party. It's almost 12 years strong, and this is intergenerational knowledge. So alumni come back and they speak. They talk about the history of the Bronx. They bring back knowledges. We have singers, performers, games. We recognize that a big part of the relationships they need space. Kids want to be kids. So are we creating space for that joy to show up? And are we also saying what joy looks like for them, right? Like, are we creating space that reflects what they need? And I see them doing that at the Peace Block Party. Other things have been creating spaces, even if it's improvisational in a classroom space, where I'm just going to go ahead and throw on some music and ask us to dance. Let us be in our body because we've been cultivate as an educator. School, and this is what we know from Carnival and Black education, is that it was moving. It's mobile. There's music, there's sound. Everyone's coming in, and education is about joy. Education is about pleasure, being in your body and being in relationship to others. So ask ourselves, how often are we planning our lesson, planning our staff meeting space, planning our student teacher meeting to incorporate some of that. So folks aren't, if we recognize the system and the structure of schooling as inherently violent, as inherently anti-Black, as inherently assimilationist, then what must we break, right? Everything. Everything. And that's what abolition is. We break everything. And so a part of that is encouraging yourself to realize that we are the actors. We are the ones, right? We are the ones to slow down. We are the ones to listen. We are the ones to draw that knowledge. Another place, I'm just going to say this briefly, but was huge, I completely agree, is as I'm working in a school space, I'm dismantling that school space. And that's a lot of work. And then there's also a piece of building women's groups. I literally, for Black women and girls, every single school, university, any place I've worked, we've had to have space outside because of the violence, because of the psychological violence that's running through our bodies, and the way in which when we speak up and say, hey, that's wrong, we're oftentimes attacked. And that's what's happening to young kids, babies in schools regularly. And so the big question is, how are we creating space for them to say and express themselves as they are? And us affirming that as you come out, however that is, that's brilliance and we need you, right? And so for me, that was only really possible in outside spaces for myself as a staff member, because I also found being attacked in that way. But Joy meant that we created space for food. We've created space for potluck. We created space of affinity groups, recognizing that sometimes this racialized violence is something that we feel like we need to jump into, be like equality, equity. Right now, we need to heal so that I can move through this sadness, this pain, and then I can get back to joy, right? And so I think hopefully that answers a good amount of the questions, but the piece for me is to encourage that joy is something that's human, that's our own, right? And we can call it, we can cultivate it.
Thank you so much for those remarks. I would love to talk more about this piece, and I want to make sure that we can have this last question before we have Q&A. And I want to target this question to Tamba Kui. As we know, the school counselor, the psychologist, the teacher workforce is disproportionately white, cis female in comparison to the student population across the country. So here's a two-part question for you. How do we grapple with this imbalance? How might we encourage, train, and recruit more school mental health professionals of color, specifically those who identify as Black? The other piece of this question, how might we prepare those in the field to be better trained and resourced to support their students navigating racial violence, even if they don't identify as Black or as BIPOC?
Ebony, thank you so much. And I'm going to invite my good brother, Dr. Moorhead, if there are things that you want to add to this process. So for me, I do work in higher education. I've trained individuals who are school counselors, psychologists, who do addictions work, who do rehabilitation. And so I'll say that I'm going to try to have a narrow response, but the issue is wide. Right. So there's not one thing. I think one of the big things that I think is important for people to hear, and I'm going to go back to what my good brother was saying in terms of Brother Moorhead, is that there's this intersectionality that we have to understand. So for somebody to become a school counselor, you have to go to college, you have to get a bachelor's, you're more than likely going to have to get a master's, some type of level of credentialing. So to go to most universities now, that means you have to have about $30,000 at the minimum to go to school for every year. So that in and of itself then is going to exclude a number of people from that experience. And so I think that then we have to really look at higher education for what it is, right? And we have to look at it as whether the individual actors, if I can connect to what my sister Jones Bay is saying, but whether the actors are doing it intentionally or unintentionally, we are part of a system where we are highlighting and accepting elitism, right? Because if everybody can't go to college, then what we're saying is about 15-20% of people can go, right? And in some communities less, and in some communities more. But what I will say, though, in terms of how do we start to change this recruitment process, we have to change what the pipeline looks like, right? So we have to change in the educational system and processes the discussion around going to college. That can't start now. I'll say it can't start in 8th grade. It has to start in 2nd grade. But it has to be supported, right? So I heard my good sister Jerica talking about this idea of schooling and education. I think those things are true, and we're in this system, right? So we can't there's right now in most places we don't have the benefit of having an alternative schooling system, right? We see that with some good charter schools. We see that in some instances in some private schools. We see that in some community-based schools, but more often than not, we have the state-run educational system. And so we have to make a change in that state-run educational system, as everybody is saying here, in terms of that pipeline. So I think the pipeline has to change, right? So I think that's the first thing. I think that means we need to have our educators see the humanity in the people of color in their classroom and believe they can be more than just athletes at their school. That it can be more than just somebody who goes into the armed forces as a means of getting outside of their community, right? So we have to see beyond that. So I think we have to expose people, as long as we're going to have the SAT, the ACT, and other entrance exams that don't really say much about somebody's humanity or their progress, then we have to expose them. If that's still going to be the metric that we use to determine their value, then we need to expose them to that earlier. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that I do work in higher education. We need to see more people who look like me and look like the rest of the panelists in higher education. I think it doesn't help me when a student says, "Wow, you're the first Black blah 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 that I've had work with me." That doesn't make me feel good. It really means it's a recognition of the failure of our system, right? And so I do think that again, that's why I'm sorry if I'm being too broad, but I think we have to have it's a multi-pronged effect that has to happen. So I think we have to change that. I think we have to think about recruiting in a different way. I think we have to then look at the curriculum. We have to have a curriculum that's inviting to the individuals who want to be school counselors, right? They have to see something other than a Eurocentric aesthetic, a Eurocentric paradigm in the teaching related to engaging in the counseling work, right? So if somebody says you can only sit with somebody for 30 minutes out, in your office, in the school, send them back to class, after they've emoted, after they've talked about all this pain and suffering, and you just say, go back to class and we're not dealing with that systemic issue, then it's really hard to get somebody on board to say, yeah, go back to your community, do this thing that I'm teaching you to do. So I think that's one. I apologize for speaking long. So the second piece I'll say here, in terms of the ways that we really have to change, this idea of how do we prepare people for that? Well, one of the first things I'll say that we have to do is that we have to really have people understand what is, and I've heard my colleagues say it, what is white supremacy? What is racism, right? We have to give definitions to these terms, right? We often use them, but people don't understand what that means in everyday life, right? If somebody just says, well, there's racism going on, they may not be able to see it in the everyday vehicle of schooling, of school counseling, of all those things. And so I do think that we have to really make it plain, make it known to individuals. I think that we have to, so if we're talking about social justice, which a lot of people like to say, and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we like to say those things, oftentimes what we're saying is, let's identify those disadvantaged individuals, and then let's help them. And oftentimes that help is then say, well, let's give them what I have, and they'll be more advantaged, right? And so again, I think my good brother Moorhead was saying that if we're talking about intersectionality, Crenshaw's work, she really was talking about not just the multiple levels of oppression, but the system of oppression and privilege. And so unless we dissect the privilege that somebody's experiencing or have in that teaching process, then we really don't understand the oppression that somebody's experiencing, right? And so, and again, I think that that those things are important. Again, I don't want to be too long-winded here, but I think that we have to shift, right? Freire was saying that in his work, that we have to shift that it can't be a rote process. It really has to be a critique of the system, and that we're really understanding what is the outcome of that thing. And so when I train individuals, I say that it is your ethical obligation, and I apologize, Dr. Moore, for taking all this time, but it's our ethical obligation to understand then the multicultural competencies. We have to understand our own values, the influences of our own biases, not just out-group bias, because most people say I don't engage in discrimination, but what they engage in is in-group prejudice. So if my network looks like me and I'm white and my network looks like me, then I'm not going to value Black kids to come to the door. if my network looks like me and I'm affluent and these poor kids are coming in the door, then I don't care about what's going on for them. I don't care in Texas that somebody got a $10,000 electric bill or that people are burning wood outside. I don't care what's happening. And when that happens, then if that's the type of training that we're contributing to, then people are going to miss it. They're going to sit in the classroom, they're going to bring the student down to their office, and they're going to miss what's happening. And so I do think we have to change. I think we have to change their focus. We have to change their understanding. And as John Henry Clark says, though, we have to see the humanity. If we don't see the humanity in individuals, then it will be all for naught. So I apologize for talking too long. I'm getting excited. But Ebony, thank you so much for that question.
Absolutely. It's at 2:15, and I want to make sure that we do have time for some Q&A from the audience. And so I know you invited Dr. Moorhead to answer, but if in some of the Q&A you can wrap in some of your answer, that'd be great. Here's a really good question. Can you respond? Wait, can you? My phone is shifting. Let's see. All right. Can you touch on how to improve anti-racism allyship among faculty and staff? Anyone can take the question.
I'll give a brief answer. Obviously, there's a lot to it. It's not a simple answer that we can all give. One thing that we've been doing at my school is affinity groups, not only for our students, but also for our staff, so that we can lean into these tough conversations. One thing is being able to, for our Black staff members, any demands, any hopes, any requests that they have, bringing that to the table as a whole staff as well, and leaning into that. How can we support them? How can we support our Brown students and Brown staff members as well? I think, obviously the work has to be done. Like, no one can do this work for you. There is no answer that I can straight up give you. This is something that is, as an individual, you need to dive into how these forms of oppression work. What are your privileges? And, how do you start to see everyone as a human being at the end of the day? So, but in schools, having those conversations as a staff, separately in affinity groups, but then coming together as a whole community, right? Because that's what we're building. We're trying to create a new community, a new culture. Having those conversations there, and then little by little, always, pushing that road forward.
Thank you, Jorge. Anybody else want to chime in on the question?
Do you mind saying the question one more time?
Absolutely, don't mind. Can you touch on how to improve anti-racism allyship among faculty and staff?
That's a hot one.
It's big. It's big, and it's not simple.
That's real. Okay. Thank you for the folks who are asking those questions, because it's one of those questions that brought me to academia, largely because I think the distinction between school and education, and recognizing that moving from outside of school, learning, again, I told you I learned in the flea market, I learn everywhere. I'm learning with anybody. In a lot of our communities, that's what we're taught. Knowledge comes from, as we're moving through the world, right? But one of the things that was difficult, and I want to share this as an experience as a Black woman, as an educator moving through, is that I think it's really important for us to be intentional when we say support Black women or support BIPOC teachers and educators, what that actually looks like. So one of the ways in which I think racial violence can persist is through actually not slowing down to be like, let's go ahead and give the Black teacher all the things, or all the Black students, and basically kind of putting folks into categories, as opposed to recognizing the structures that continue to oppress them. One, BIPOC teachers and oftentimes are put within multiple layers of trauma, witnessing the way racism functions on the young people, listening to the young people who come to them to process their own racialized pain and violence that they're experiencing in school and also out of school. And so we're recognizing that there's layered, and then also you think about, as a Black staff or BIPOC staff, you're also addressing your colleagues who also in many ways have read Audre Lorde, have read the different critical texts, and will oftentimes weaponize them against you in the process of moving forward a still white supremacist kind of vision of what schooling is, right? What it means for Black and Brown children to be successful. When we're saying, hey, that's not our definition of success for these young ones. We're thinking about them lifelong, right? Sorry, I don't know if I spoke over, but my piece is awareness. And I think one of the big pieces is that we need to pay staff who are doing this work. We need to recognize that the economic stress already on Black families and BIPOC people. We need to make sure that there are mental health support and services to support these folks who are doing this work, because we must recognize that this work oftentimes is applauded and also violently attacked in invisible ways in the process of being a Black educator, a BIPOC educator, that they're navigating very intense terrains in these school spaces to try to hold space after school, at lunch, off, so for me, as I think about it, it's asking who has privilege in the school space, and will you stand up, create space, build some sort of economic support? Will you stand up to take a role that's oftentimes assigned to a Black staff member? Will you listen to what they're saying and then also implement a structural shift in the way that school happens, so they're not, the new Black staff member or the new BIPOC staff member isn't always taken and pushed into this role as leader on issues of diversity and equity when it's actually, again, in the water of the school. And so it's major upheaval that's necessary. And we can't just continue to look at the BIPOC folks to be the leaders of this, but please listen to them and pay them for their labor.
Yes, I all of that, everything you said, yes. I want to squeeze in this last question. I know we are running short on time, but I feel like this is a really good question. And a lot of you have spoken to curriculum. We don't have a whole lot of time for it, maybe 1 or 2 minutes. So remarks are going to have to be brief. How do we increase the cultural awareness, reassurance, and acceptance of the population without a shift in curriculum? Anyone want to try it?
You don't have to shift the curriculum. We can keep the curriculum. Well, here's what I'll say. Again, education versus schooling. So it is a shift, right? But it doesn't mean we change the quality of our education. So it means you need to change the location of the researcher, right? So Sister Marie is talking about the work that she's doing. So what if you're looking at her study versus looking at another study that says that this person is inferior in this space? So I think we need to look at who is doing research that actually is doing research from the perspective of people of color, for disenfranchised individual, for LGBT community. We really have to start looking at a very different way, right? I think we have to start looking at then how we, so that's a shift in the curriculum, right? And so if people are not, and as Sister Jones Bay is saying, don't weaponize the thing that you're learning then. Just because you learn something cool from Audre Lorde doesn't mean that now you understand what James Baldwin is saying, or what Joseph White is saying, or what whoever is saying, right? So I think that means we need to make sure that we have individuals who are teaching the curriculum, who look similar to the individuals who are sitting in the chairs learning the curriculum. That we have to have different principals, different superintendents. We have to have different universities. We have to hold people accountable. So we can have a shift in the curriculum, or a shift in the learning process and shift the curriculum, but not lose the quality of education. The assumption is that people of color are producing less scholarly materials, and that's false. That's the implication in the question. And no hate to the person who says it, but that's because of white supremacy is the cloud for which we stay under all the time. And it makes us think that the sun is not shining. It makes us think that it's a cloudy day. And so I think it is to shift our perspective, shift our understanding, and then I think it changes then the educational process. And I apologize to my sister Coffee because I see her, so I'm gonna shut up.
You're getting me fired up, so I'm like off of what you're saying. And I so appreciate everything you say. I hope I don't sound repetitive, but I heard that question almost as a rhetorical, right? You can't. You got to change the curriculum. But you don't have to, like, teachers are always like, oh, but the rigor or whatever. And we have epistemologies in every discipline. People of color, BIPOC folks have epistemologies that are valuable, that are valid, that are rigorous in every discipline. You don't have to learn science from a white supremacist lens. And so it's just so I heard that question as an argument, and I really invite all of us to do more research and do more reading. And we got folks on this panel doing the research we can read. It doesn't have to be an either or, right? Our kids can still learn science, can still learn healing, can learn all of those things, and learn it in their own communities. And learn it through their indigenous ways of knowing and indigenous knowledge. And so I'm sorry, I hope I didn't interrupt you. I was just definitely like on fire with everything you said.
Thank you so much, Jerica. Anybody else on that real quick, like second or anything that you want to respond to that around the curriculum? I was also really excited that I heard the question, like, how does the culture shift happen if the curriculum is still very white supremacist? Other thoughts to the question? Otherwise, I'm going to kick it to Nadia to close us out. Go ahead, Virgil.
One thing, I think that, like Jericho was saying, that we have wisdom and traditions and practices within our own sort of, let's say, as indigenous people, native people, that we have ways of doing things that are science, that and here's the thing is that the youth and the students are interested in that. And so we have to tap into intrinsic motivation. When we tap into passion and purpose, then people in the youth will stay in school and be more likely to succeed. And guess what? That's going to improve their mental health. When they're passionate, when they're having and being part of schools where they learn about themselves, where they're able to figure out how to care for their community, their mental health improves, their character development improves, and their schooling improves. And so I think it's important to see that intersection between curriculum, the right kind of school, the right kind of educating, and mental health and wellness.